So one of the questions that I get from parents all the time, and this might be slightly topical, but we get questions about developmental milestones
Yep.
and primitive reflexes. Can you explain what those are? They're both completely different. And how do they relate to any underlying causes?
Yeah, okay. So I guess probably one of the biggest things to understand is that human beings are born developmentally very early compared to any other mammal. So you watch a calf that's born and it can kind of wobbly, get up on its feet, and it can find its mum and it can feed, and within a few days it's kind of keeping up with the herd, and a lot of mammals are like that. Humans are born pretty useless, right? We are entirely dependent on our primary caregivers for survival.
Until they're 28. Sorry,
Sometimes
Mum.
older.
Yeah.
So they're entirely dependent on the primary caregivers. Like, in a way, we're a bit more like marsupials than we are mammals. Like, we need to have our primary caregivers with us all the time in order to survive. We cannot necessarily be separated from them for an extended period of time. So the thing that makes us a little bit useless at birth is also the thing that makes us very human. So we are hardwired right from birth to connect with our primary caregivers. So that is very, very important, that our primary caregivers love us to pieces, and that we are able to communicate through cues to our primary caregivers for them to take care of us. So this is that kind of dyad, often between, biological mother and child, but it's, human beings are hardwired to form connections with a small kind of number of caregivers. It's not just mother and child. And that connection is what actually helps us develop all of our amazing human qualities. So empathy, forward planning, a lot of stuff that's associated with the prefrontal cortex that, allows us to be humans, okay? Yeah. But that happens over a trajectory of time and environmental inputs. So our brains, when we're born, we have more like brain cells or neurons than we will ever have throughout our entire life. We're born with the most. And what happens is that we have a selective die-off of brain cells because we start to form connections. So when we're born, there's not a lot of connections there. There is a lot, don't get me wrong, but we need to form these connections, and those connections happen from environmental cues. So we are born with what's known as primitive reflexes, right? And this is what we hear about, like retained primitive reflexes, and we hear about them as like kind of that they're a bad thing. They're really important when we're born. Like, we need them to land, and sometimes they don't land well, which means that we've got an interference to us being able to survive, because most of those primitive reflexes are associated with survival, and a lot of them are associated with the functions of breathe, suck, and swallow. So if you've watched, there's a really great film documentary about delivery self-attachment. Have you seen that one?
Not yet.
No? Okay, so that's where an infant is born with no intervention, and the primitive reflexes kick into gear. The mother doesn't do anything, she's just lying there. It's quite a peaceful birth, and the baby's able to kick into gear all of these primitive reflexes, navigate their way up the mother's torso and latch onto the breast.
Wow.
No intervention, right? That's a bit of a unicorn, doesn't happen very often. I had 3 home births and that didn't happen, but that's what our primitive reflexes are there for survival, for us to be able to do that, amongst other survival things. So we need those reflexes to land. They're like our tree kind of roots, right? We need those there in order to be able to then progress on. So if you think about like concentric circles, the primitive reflexes are right in the middle. When we start to navigate essentially gravity, when we're in a gravity-based environment, we're born, we need to start to be able to, over a longer period of time than the calf, but we need to be able to do essentially the same thing. Get up, move ourselves around, keep up with the pack. If we were born at that stage, we'd be born at about 2 years of age. Well, that's not healthy for the mother's pelvis, nor for the child. So, from an evolutionary perspective, we're born a bit earlier and we are reliant on our caregivers. So what happens is through like a number of different environmental factors, we start to develop what's known as postural control or volitional control. So one of the first ones that we see is babies able to hold their head up. and then they're able to push up, and then they're able to turn their head without turning their entire body, and then they're able to, there's all these kind of layers of development, and this is what is known as the developmental milestones. We often just think about crawling as a developmental milestone, but there's a whole lot more that happened before then. These developmental milestones are essentially in place so that a child can navigate themselves through a gravity-based environment and form strong connections within their community, within their tribe. Like, we are hardwired for connection. Humans really do need other humans to survive from an evolutionary perspective. So that's the next concentric circle out. So we've got our primitive reflexes in the middle, and then we've got our postural development, or postural reflexes, postural control on top of that. Those postural developmental milestones put the lid on the primitive reflexes. We will always have the primitive reflexes in our brainstem, so the bottom part of our brain. And you see, like, if someone has a traumatic brain injury or something like that, you'll see them doing funny movements and head movements, hand movements, mouth movements. That's because they've had higher brain damage, which has meant that the brainstem is then expressing some of these primitive reflexes again.
Like a default
it
mode.
Goes back into a default mode, and so you'll see this with children sometimes as well. If there's been any sort of thing that's affected their brain in some way, you can see that they've still got these primitive reflexes expressing. So they're now not got the lid of the postural control. So the primitive reflexes still expressing themselves interferes with that child being able to essentially navigate themselves through a gravity-based environment and form connections and learn, which is then affecting their cognitive development. And so that's where we see a lot of information that's now, and it's really good that that's available, where they say, if you've got a retained this reflex, you'll show this. If you've got this reflex retained, you'll show this. It's because those primitive reflexes are kind of ballooning out and interfering with our cognitive development, because it's keeping us in that very infant state. And this is where it's, there's lots of different schools of thought about primitive reflexes. So essentially, use it and it integrates. That's the basic, right? We're born, we land, we need to use our primitive reflexes. We then respond to environmental stimulus, gravity, interactions, all the rest of it. That then develops the positional or postural control, which then allows us to go and learn and be humans, right? In an ideal world, that's the trajectory that we follow. But there are so many things that can happen in life, different traumas, so physical trauma, mental, emotional trauma, chemical traumas, what we talk about in like the T's of chiropractic, that will interfere with that child developing along that trajectory. So it will mean that they don't necessarily develop their ability to hold their head up. That's one of the most important ones that we see as chiropractors, particularly if there's been any intrauterine constraint, birth trauma, inability to be able to latch and feed, any other sort of contributing factors that inhibit a child from activating the cerebellum, like midline cerebellum nuclei, which stimulate them to hold their head up and start to relate to how they move their eyes and then how they move their head because of the subluxation. That can then lead to them not putting the lid on those primitive reflexes well.
Yeah. Okay,
so that's where we as chiropractors start to look at, well, what is interfering with this child being able to navigate themselves through a gravity-based environment and interact with other human beings and have that cognitive development. And that's where that's kind of our approach to looking at primitive reflexes. There's lots of other aspects as well that have been well researched and evidence-based about, neurointegration exercises and things like that. But I think from my experience, having learned that and learned about the neurophysiology of chiropractic, if we have that disconnection and that subluxation and the brain doesn't know where the body is, it's much harder for those exercises that are designed to help to integrate primitive reflexes to land.
Yeah.